Hello, I'm Robert Lau with you. I'm a senator in the Parliament of Malaysia. My appointment was on 22nd June 2020 at the recommendation of our Prime Minister Tan Sri Muhyiddin and endorsed by the Yang di-Pertua Agong. My maiden speech was on 7th September during my first sitting in the Senate. That was on 3rd of September till 23rd of September, and I was slotted to deliver my first speech, and that is called the Maiden Speech. During my Maiden Speech, I focus on a few issues. The first one is on the formation of Malaysia. Malaysia came about on 16 September 1963. That history of Malaysia formation has not been taught in our school, and up to now many Malaysians do not know how it came about. Sarawak was a British colony from 1946 after the Second World War until 1963, when the idea of formation of Malaysia was realized. Malaysia was formed by 4 territories. The first was the Federation of Malaya, which at that time was already an independent country, which was independent on 31st August 1957. With Malaya, then there are another 3 territories together form Malaysia on 16 September 1963. The other 3 territories are Singapore, Sarawak, and North Borneo, which was later renamed as Sabah. With these 4 territories, the Federation Malaysia was realized. This issue has not been very much talked about at the school level or even at the national level or even in the Dewan itself. The first issue, if we look at it, is the definition of the word federation. In our Constitution of Malaysia, 1963, the word definition was defined in Article 160. It is quite puzzling that the word federation was defined as the Federation of Malaya Agreement 1957 and not as the Federation of Malaysia Agreement 1963. Why is it, even up to now as I'm talking here, it is still defined as the Federation of Malaya 1957. Why? And I think this is something very pertinent and going back to the roots, the fundamental of our country. If we are not on the right footing, then it does not bode well as to the direction that we are going. How are we going to tell the people of Sabah and Sarawak that people of these 2 states are defined as Malaya and not Malaysian? And I think this is where our leadership really has to look at it, the very fundamental, the foundation of our country. As we all know, that Singapore left or separated from Malaysia on 9th of August 1965, so it was only left with the Sarawak and Sabah. 16th September 1963 was the day Malaysia was formed. This date was only celebrated and officially recognized nationwide 11 years ago when it was declared as a public holiday. So for the past 57 years, it was only last 10 years, recognition was given that Malaysia actual National Day was 16 September 1963 and not 31st August 1957. This year, the celebration of the National Day was held in Cebu, and for the last 4 years consecutively, the celebration of Malaysia Day had been held in Sarawak and Sabah. I was just wondering, why is that so? Should the celebration of Malaysia be confined to only these 2 states and not in Malaya? I would suggest that it should go to the capital of all the states in the Federation of Malaya too. The third issue under this formation of Malaysia, or the Malaysia Agreement, is the Constitution, the foundation of the country, our federal Constitution. As I mentioned just now, the point on the definition of it, that's just one point, but that's the key point. I myself being a lawyer, I've known a lot of lawyers, those who are graduate locally, the law school do not teach them about this point. They do not teach the Constitution of 1963, how Malaysia came about, how the Constitution of 1963 came about, the ins and outs, and that is really quite surprising. Our Constitution in 1963 was not drawn up as a new document from scratch. It was actually a revision of the 1957 Malaya Constitution. constitution. So the Malayan Constitution 1957 was used as the template, and amendment was made to it to fit Sarawak, Sabah and Singapore into it. So there was a lot of amendment. Roughly about 60 to 70% or 2/3 of the 1957 Constitution was amended. I just give some figures here. There are 183 articles in the Constitution. 92 of them was amended. On top of that, 32 new articles was added. 11 articles were removed. 9 out of 13 schedules were amended, and 1 schedule was removed. So it was quite a wholesale amendment done in a very short period of time, when the negotiation of the formation of Malaysia just kicked in early 1962. So they got less than 2 years to actually come up with a draft of a constitution trying to put 4 territories together. And obviously there are a lot of things that do not really gel. It will take time to work it out. What is said is that from 1965 to 2013, there were many amendments being made to our constitution that was passed through the parliament. To amend the constitution, we need 2/3 majority of the Dewan Rakyat members and also the Senate. 1965 is a significant date. Why is it so? If you recall, I mentioned just now, Singapore left Malaysia in 1965 August. From then onwards, in fact, few months later, in 1966, our constitution was amended and continued to be amended until 2013. Most of this amendment has a big impact restricting or curtailing, taking away the rights of Sarawak and Sabah. Our rights was shrunk from what was originally agreed in the 1963 Act. Why did this happen? There is only one safeguard in our constitution, one safeguard for Singapore, Sarawak and Sabah, to protect the minority, because Sarawak, Sabah and Singapore were the minority compared to Federation of Malaya in terms of population, in terms of power, based on the number of MPs. So it was agreed at that time by all the parties that 1/3 of the members of parliament must come from Sabah, Sarawak and Singapore, so as to act as a check on the Malaya in unilaterally using the 2/3 majority to amend the constitution. The assumption is that the 3 states, Sabah, Sarawak and Singapore, with 1/3 of the members of parliament, will oppose any amendment that will infringe or curtail the rights of these 3 states. That was the intention in 1963. But by 1965, when Singapore left, Singapore had 15 members of parliament out of 154 members at that time. Of these 15 members from Singapore, when Singapore left the parliament controlled by Federation of Malaya, they made the decision to cancel, abolish these 15 seats. Instead of giving these 15 seats to Sarawak and Sabah, Sarawak and Sabah government requested for these to be given to them, so as the safeguard will still be maintained. But that request was denied to Sarawak and Sabah. Hence, the only safeguard was taken away. And that is the first of the many when the rule of the majority was applied to the detriment of people of Sarawak and Sabah. In my Senate speech, I asked that this be restored, and every Sarawakian, Sabahan MP should do the same. Speak up and get these basic safeguards returned to Sarawak and Sabah. The other issue which I want to touch on, which is related to how the constitution was being infringed in respect to the rights of Sarawak and Sabah, is the Territorial Seas Act 2012. This has to do with the wealth of Sarawak and Sabah, the wealth of natural resources, oil and gas. When Sarawak formed Malaysia, Sarawak has its own boundary in 1963. The Sarawak's boundary has been set in the law that was passed by the British colonial government, and that was recognized and inserted into the Malaysia Agreement, where is the boundary of Sarawak and Sabah. And that boundary is not only as to the land, that physical land that we see, but it goes on as is in the international law, also land underneath the sea, which is called the continental shelf, forms part of the territory of a country. So Sarawak has its own continental shelf prior to 1963. And we all know the topics, the oil rights that Sarawak now is talking on. which Sarawak wants it back. What happened was that in 1969, May 13, 1969, there was racial riots in Kuala Lumpur, basically, and some of the major towns in West Malaysia. Nothing happened in Sarawak and Sabah because it was peaceful, but emergency rule was imposed throughout the whole country in 1969. Under the emergency rule, the power is taken away from the parliament. Parliament was suspended. It rests in the hand of the chairperson of the National Security Council, whom at that time was the Deputy Prime Minister, Abdul Razak. So basically, that one person has a full authority running the country by executive order. So what happened in 1969, which was a racial riot, the government, which is run under emergency rule government, they use its power to extend the Malayan law on the continental shelf that applies to Malaya to Sarawak and Sabah, taking away our own Sarawak's law that define our boundary. They impose the law using executive order. And they also later on subsequently passed another law, which is the Petroleum Development Act 1974, which gives all the oil and gas that is found offshore to a company called Petronas, which is owned by the federal government. So that was an abuse of power using the emergency rule to amend our Sarawak's boundary. Our emergency ordinance that was passed in 1969 was on our law books. It was valid until 2011 November. It was only repealed in November 2011. And under our federal constitution, the emergency ordinance will lapse after 6 months. So all those executive order laws that was passed by the National Security Council during the emergency period would no longer be valid. So when the Continental Shelf Act that was extended to Sarawak using executive order expired in April 2012, the federal government passed another law. They call it the Territorial Seas Act 2012, which actually replicate the Continental Shelf Act that was passed to Sarawak and Sabah during the emergency period. And it was quite extraordinary that this thing happened second time. The taking away of the rights of Sarawak and Sabah happened again in 2012, which was just not too long ago. And this Territorial Seas Act was passed by the Parliament legitimately, procedurally was done correctly, but legitimately is being called into question because the Territorial Seas Act again redefined the boundary of Sarawak and Sabah. And this cannot be done under our federal constitution without two other steps that must be taken. First, the states that is affected must agree through their own Dewan Undangan agree. The Legislative Council must agree to it. Number two, the Yang di-Pertua Agong must also consent to it. Our TSA 2012 did not have these two consent. Therefore, it was my submission and it was also my appeal to the Prime Minister that this Territorial Seas Act should be amended to exclude Sarawak